Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time. Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Binus, and I'm a psychiatrist. And joining me today is...
My name is Jonathan Edens, and I'm a psychiatric PA.
All right. Well, today we're going to be talking about treatments for major depressive disorder. And this is really, in a lot of ways, what we do day in, day out, isn't it? And so let's just dive right into some of the things that we can do to treat depression, because I think it's so important to give our listeners a sense of hope, especially if you are struggling with depression or you have a loved one who is struggling with depression. Because again, with depression, oftentimes a big part of it is that sense of hopelessness. There's nothing I can do. I don't know the way out. But the good news is there are actually a lot of things that we can do. So, Jonathan, why don't you go ahead and start telling us about some of the things that will give us hope and help us on our journey?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is there's no one size fits all approach, right? It's and also a comprehensive and holistic approach, we believe to be the best. So, it's not that there's one therapy or one medication or one lifestyle intervention that really is going to, be the end all be all. In many cases, especially with the patients that are coming to us, right? Patients that have gone past their primary care doctor and need to see a specialist, we need to use an all hands on deck sort of approach. And so also, the type of treatment that's going to be used or the type of regimen or protocol that's going to be used is probably going to change over time, depending on the characteristics of your depression, the level of severity, the frequency in which you have these episodes. So it's
So are you saying there's no one size fits all?
I am saying that. And I also say, we are not, unless we are your actual prescribers, we need to put a disclaimer here, and that you should always talk to your doctor about these things in particular before you make any medical decisions.
Yes. Thank you for reiterating that, because I think that is actually a very important point, that people don't try to do this don't do this at home, right? Yeah. All by yourself, at least.
The purpose of this podcast is to give you some ideas about some things that, maybe you can take this information and you can take it to your doctor, right? You can make informed decisions about, is this something that maybe I'm not getting all the tools that I have or that I can utilize? And we're hopefully, trying to get the ball rolling, get some of those ideas flowing so that you can incorporate some of them into your own life with the help of a qualified professional.
And I want to make a comment there because, I really, I know physicians are often stressed to the max, and I so appreciate, especially my hardworking colleagues in the primary care setting. But, to be frank, primary care physicians and practitioners, they just often don't have the time to delve into this more holistic approach. And
Sure.
So, I get it. I'm not saying it's all bad. Like if there's depressive symptoms, then, they often need to just prescribe something and go on with the appointment, because there's 3 other things they need to address too. But, if you're one of those individuals who maybe has taken an antidepressant or, something for your mental health and it's just not getting much better, then it is really important to seek help that's more holistic. And again, this is not talking down on, but it's just, that's not their niche. That's not their specialty. And so it's okay to reach out for more help. And there's so much more that can be done. And, one other thing there is that I think that as people actually engage with some of these other things beyond medication, it gives you more of a sense of empowerment. Like I can actually do something rather than just like, oh, I just have to take a pill and then it magically gets better. And sure, it's great if the symptoms are better, but it doesn't always help as much with the psychological element too, of like, hey, you know what? I've been able to like get some control back here in my life.
So we're going to start with the foundational recommendations, foundational treatments, so to speak, things that, for the vast majority of people that come to our clinic, we're making these recommendations, right? These are things that we really want to try to get you optimized as much as we can, because long-term, this is going to help you not only with your mental health, but your physical health, your social life, and so on, right? So first, we want to focus on physical health improvements. So this includes things like enhancing your nutrition, right? Making sure you're eating a more holistic plant-based diet with really highly nutrient-dense foods. We want to optimize your hydration.
Now I noticed you skipped over that almost a little fast, the
Okay.
plant-based part, like almost like you were a little embarrassed to say it. Now, tell me a little more about that.
Well, we do have a podcast specifically on this topic. So if you're looking for a lot of detail, you can go to that podcast. But basically, so our whole food plant-based diet is really emphasizing plant-based food, so not animal products. However, things that are minimally processed or not processed whatsoever. Right? Dr. Michael Greger from nutritionfacts.org, he has kind of a statement. So something that is processed is nothing bad added, nothing good taken away. Right? So if you're following that as sort of a general rule of thumb, and you're consuming a wide variety of minimally processed plant-based foods that have lots of color, that have lots of nutrients in them, right? Then that is a really good foundation to give you the best chance of success, because your brain is the organ that requires the most nutrients of anything, right, in your body. So it's important to give it the food it needs.
Absolutely. Now, in some of our listeners might be like, "What plant? Why? Okay, I get the whole foods part. That's pretty logical, but why the plant-based?" In a nutshell, I know we could again talk about this for a long time, but in a nutshell, what would you tell our listeners as far as like why the plant-based part?
So we talked in a previous podcast, about many of the different mechanisms behind what, some of the root causes, so to speak, of what causes clinical depression. And if we were to go through, each one of those mechanisms, a lot of them can be improved upon by having a really nutritious diet, right? So for example, the monoamine hypothesis, right? There are actually specific foods, predominantly in the plant-based kingdom, that are really good at enhancing the production of those monoamines at levels that are actually optimal, right? So it's not just about the mass production of these monoamines, but it's actually about getting the right sort of regulatory balance of those neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. Another one that we talked about is the inflammation, right? So you want to eat an anti-inflammatory diet, and most people may not think this, but really animal-based products and
Dairy.
And dairy and processed foods, right? These are all very pro-inflammatory, and that was actually something we didn't talk about in the previous podcast. But CRP, which is C-reactive protein, is an inflammatory cytokine that we generally will test people when they're having inflammatory conditions. We see a much higher rate of CRP elevations in patients with depression. So a lot of patients with depression would benefit from an anti-inflammatory diet, which would include mostly plant-based.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And I know you and I have both had our journey, right? Like we both eaten meat in the past, and I will be honest, I've enjoyed it very much when when I have. But we've realized like, hey, this is actually doesn't do me as good as a plant-based diet, and so going through that and experiencing that myself, I think it's pretty amazing, and the mental clarity, and overall the energy level and everything that accompanies a better diet is pretty drastic. I've noticed a difference in my life.
So I briefly mentioned water, hydration. That's going to be incredibly important. A lot of the body is composed of water, or the brain is predominantly composed, or there's a lot of weight associated with the brain that involves liquid, involves water. So having adequate hydration, if you're dehydrated, that can impair. And they've shown this in many studies, that can impair cognitive function to a significant degree, just being slightly dehydrated.
Absolutely.
So exercise is kind of another physical health improvement. So, we also have a podcast that goes into a lot more depth on exercise, but, in that regard, basically just getting regular exercise, getting your heart rate up, right? Making sure you're sweating a little bit if you can, doing it socially, doing something that you actually enjoy. Right? These are things that are going to keep it as a habit in the long term.
Absolutely.
And then I'll add a few more, just sleep, light, and oxygen. These things are also incredibly important to maintaining overall healthy sort of physical state.
Yeah, and all of those are super important, but I'll tell you that when people are not sleeping consistently, that's one of the first things I try to go after is like, okay, how can we improve your sleep? Because, during sleep, your brain and your body are really rejuvenating. And if you don't have that time that your brain has to kind of reset and to reboot and to even do some brain cleaning, if you will, and repair, then that makes it very difficult to really make progress and get out of that hole of depression.
So what's the next foundational treatment, Dr.
Well,
Binus?
when I think about treating, I often think about the kind of four pillars, if you will. In Loma Linda University, which is where I trained, we talked about the bio, psycho, social, spiritual model. And so those are kind of the four pillars of the areas that we need to address. And so we've talked about the biological part, like how are we treating our bodies, right? And that's super important. But then the psychological and the social and the spiritual, those are the other three pillars that we want to really address.
So let's talk about the social first. So why is being social? Why is this so important for depression?
Well, studies are very clear that loneliness actually exacerbates depression in a huge way. So when people feel disconnected, and what's interesting is you can be lonely in a crowd.
Mm.
A lot of
Hmm.
people do interact with others, but inside they have this sense of disconnectedness. And so it's not always about the amount of interactions people have with other people, it's the quality of those interactions. And on the other hand, there are people that actually like spending a lot of time alone, but they don't feel lonely. They have a sense of connectedness maybe with nature, and then they have maybe a few small amount of relationships, but they're pretty meaningful. That can do them good. So there's a lot of positive with socialization. I mean, one of those is even there's studies even that show that when people are social, it actually helps to regulate the immune system in a positive way, and they're less likely to get sick, for example. So it helps, I think, the stress level in a
Mm.
lot of way. At a very foundational level, it helps our body's adaptation. And, as they say, trials shared are halves and joys shared are doubled,
Mm.
right? So there's a sense like when we're connected with other people that, even if we're going through a rough time, it makes it easier. You've heard the saying, "Misery loves company," right? It makes it it makes it easier. Not that we want to drag people into misery, but it makes it easier to go through hard times. And then those times that are good, it's like it magnifies the joy.
So I would say one comment on that is that social connections just in general are important, but you want quality social connections, and they say you're the average of the five people you spend the most time with. So if your friends and your family are also kind of pulling you down, right? Maybe they're kind of toxic, or they're just really negative, and that can, clearly, like individuals, because we're such social creatures, we tend to be somewhat of a sponge towards other people's emotions and behaviors. And so sometimes, if appropriate, it may be good to kind of separate yourself, from some of these individuals and try to spend more time with people that are going to be more uplifting for you, right? I think that's an important point to make.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And, obviously we can't like say, well, I want a new brother or a new sister or a new mom or dad, but we can still say, you know what, maybe I need to put some boundaries here with the amount of time I spend, the amount of interactions, and maybe I need to spend some time with some new friends or some other people that are actually more positive and uplifting, because that, like you said, that quality is very important.
And last thing I'll say about that is make sure you're not the person that's being the toxic one for everybody else, right? So it's gonna require a little bit of social awareness. But one of the easiest way to tell if somebody's a narcissist is if they're calling everybody else narcissist, right? And so if you're thinking that everybody else is toxic, maybe you need to take a look in the mirror and evaluate kind of your own character and some of the things that maybe you need to work on as well.
Are you calling me a narcissist?
No.
Oh, okay. All right. So let's move on. So we talked about the biological, and one thing that I should probably mention about, and I don't know if I should include it under biological or psychological, but addiction, I think is a really important thing to touch on, because, addiction can definitely predispose people to major depression as well as other mental disorders.
Yeah, absolutely. Was there anything more you wanted to say on that?
Well, when we think about addiction too, we're not just talking about substances, right? So
Sure.
that's the most obvious one, but there's also a lot of behavioral addictions, like
Technology, pornography, video games,
for some people
many
shopping,
others,
right?
shopping.
Food.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there can be all sorts of behavioral addictions that people can get into that can definitely predispose as well.
So moving on to spiritual, spiritual treatment, so to speak. And this is, this is a really important point. And, this may be of the four, the one that I think a lot of listeners may be slightly confused. Like, why do we include this as one of the four pillars, so to speak? And, there's been over 400 scientific studies dating back to the 1960s that have demonstrated that there's an inverse relationship between spirituality and depression in the majority of cases. I mean, what this means is essentially the more spiritual you become and the more invested in like a like-minded community that believes in a lot of similar things that you do, that you believe as well, the lower your rates of depression, the lower the rates of depression in that community that we see.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because in the past, psychiatry actually, in a way, I'll use the word demonized spirituality, and they
Sure.
said it was actually an unhealthy coping mechanism.
Mm.
But when they actually did the research on religion and spirituality, they found exactly what you said, that it's actually a very healthy thing. Now, that being said, I'll ask you this: do you think there might be unhealthy forms of religion, spirituality, and healthy ones?
Yeah, I'd absolutely say that. The thing that I think comes to mind the most is a sort of spirituality that focuses on self, right? One
Hmm.
that focuses on kind of your own impressions, your own ideas, about maybe a higher being that doesn't really contradict you, right? Part of what we do in psychiatry for a lot of people is somewhat uncomfortable. When you're going to see a therapist, we're always there. We're frequently challenging the ideas and the predispositions that you might have, so that you can learn and that you can become better, right? But if your spirituality is really just focused on yourself and it's not something that really causes you to grow and become a better person, then what purpose does it serve other than inflating your own ego?
That's actually a really good point. So, am I hearing you right that a healthy spirituality would actually potentially challenge some of your paradigms and challenge you to maybe look at things differently and challenge you to grow outside of, rather than just like a pat on the back and saying, "Oh yeah, you did a good job." Like you said, a good psychotherapist is actually not going to just be like, "Oh yeah, everything you think is fine and thing that you believe is fine," right? Healthy spirituality will often challenge a lot of our underlying core beliefs.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, if they have an idea of a God, right? It might be a God that's sort of like a dog, right? He's just there to love you, or he or she, is there to love you really no matter what you do, right? And a dog is never really going to challenge you. A dog is never going to help you become the best version of yourself that you really should, right?
Absolutely.
So some aspects aside from just that of what we just talked about of spirituality that can really be helpful is because it can increase a sense of purpose, right?
Hmm.
It can provide more hope for the future, and it can provide a community of like-minded individuals in which you can share your experiences. And as we talked about, socialization is really key. Positive socialization is really key, but also, having a lot of people that you have this sort of foundational similarity with, right? When you can build these friendships and you can grow with them as well, it's good to have that level of support.
Absolutely. And, just as a further comment as on unhealthy versus healthy spirituality, one of the things that, I'm guessing that some of those studies, because there were a few that showed like actually a negative effect of religion and spirituality on mental health, probably had to do with types of religion or spiritual practices that weren't so healthy. And so there are things that we kind of want to look out for as well. Now, one of those I think is our picture of God. There was actually one study that they did, and this was an interesting study they did on HIV patients.
Mm.
And so they looked at the T cells, which are the T helper cells, which are the ones that are attacked by the HIV virus. And they wanted to see, like, are those actually affected by your view of God? And so they had three groups. They had one group that believed in a loving picture of God, another one that believed in a judgmental, angry, retributive sort of picture of God, and the third group that didn't believe in God at all. And what they found was that the group that actually believed in a loving God had the highest level of T helper cells, so they were the least affected by HIV. The group that didn't believe in God at all actually had higher levels of T helper cells than the group that believed in angry retributive God. So the point of that study, that my take home point was like, wow, it's better to actually not believe in God at all than to believe in an angry retributive sort of picture of God.
Wow, that's a very interesting study. I'm surprised somebody came up with that design.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So it's not just important to have spirituality, but also the type of spirituality. The other thing that I think is important to really take note of too is that, you know, when we're talking about healthy religion, we need to make sure that it's never forceful, it's never coercive, manipulative. It always provides freedom, right? So anything where there's like this inappropriate guilt, manipulation, that sort of thing, that's not healthy spirituality. And that sense of like, I'm being controlled, and if I'm not doing this, then somehow, you know, I'm going to go to hell right away, or, you know, something like that. It's just, that will create more stress and more problems actually, and oftentimes inappropriate guilt, and can lead to even spiritual OCD, which some people call scrupulosity. And that can be a big problem.
So the fourth pillar of treatments is psychological treatments.
Yes.
So, you know, we're finally moving into the mind, right, if you will. So, you know, what are some psychological treatments that are going to be foundational for a lot of the patients that come see us?
Well, when we think about the psychological intervention or the therapeutic intervention that has the most evidence base, we talk about what kind of therapy? Cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Exactly. And so what is that? I mean, we don't have time to get into that, but basically it has to do with looking at our thoughts, looking at our beliefs, and how those then in turn affect our emotions and our behaviors. And so what a good therapist, and ideally people can kind of learn to become their own therapist, but what a good therapist will do is help people to dissect and say, okay, what kind of thoughts and beliefs am I having about my life, or about the situations in my life or my relationships that are then leading to negative feelings or inappropriate actions or unhealthy behaviors, and then really challenging those. And in my mind, it's a beautiful thing because we just talked about the spiritual component, right? This is actually where, when we reframe or when we change our beliefs, if we have that spiritual backdrop to do it from, that can be very helpful to kind of integrate those two things.
Yeah. You know, I for a lot of my patients, I describe to them when I'm kind of walking through what CBT is and really how it can benefit you. You know, all of us have had kind of an aha moment, right? An aha moment is essentially when you come to believe something, you come to realize something you didn't previously believe, right? And it sort of sits deep with you and you like truly believe it. And in those moments, like, when you have that aha moment, like, it feels really good, right? It can change your emotional state almost immediately. And that's, you know, that doesn't always happen necessarily. It doesn't always happen like right away. But a lot of times with cognitive therapy, if it's done right, if it's done well, people's original sort of core belief can change sometimes instantaneously, and they can have that aha moment that will drastically and almost immediately even change their emotional experience.
Absolutely. And in my mind, that's kind of like a paradigm shift that someone can go through. And it's exciting, you know, when you see like, oh, wow, the eyes open. I never thought about it that way. And sometimes it can be just a simple way of looking at things that you never did before. And you're like, suddenly now I'm seeing the glass half full instead of half empty.
So there are a number of other psychological treatments, and we're not going to go through all of them in detail. But you know, DBT is another common one that we use, particularly here at Beautiful Minds. You know, this is more so focused on specific tools, particularly for regulating really intense emotions. It's kind of classically it was designed for patients with borderline personality disorder that have a lot of issues with relationships, that have a lot of issues with self-harm, and so it's a very useful tool for many people that are dealing with emotional problems. But you know, a little bit more specific for specific groups of people.
And by the way, that stands for dialectical behavioral therapy. And like you said, it's not just good for borderlines, but for all sorts of conditions. And it's actually a subtype of cognitive behavioral therapy.
And so a few more we'll just briefly mention, but interpersonal therapy. So this is mainly focused on, helping you in your relationships with other individuals. If there's a lot of tension, maybe it's in, even it's in a marriage or coworkers, that can be extremely helpful. And then if you maybe if it's in a marriage and you get both of those individuals in a group, right, or maybe you get the family together, right, for therapy sessions, right, this would be considered marriage and family therapy. And then, maybe for people that are dealing with loss, a lot of times we'll do some grief counseling.
Absolutely. And those are all very key depending on the different situation. So anything else that we need to touch base on regarding treatments for major depressive disorder?
So the next step in terms of the treatment protocol that we're typically using, especially when we're considering kind of severity of symptoms, might be supplements, right? So and this might be a little bit strange to people, especially if maybe they've been going to multiple psychiatrists and all they're ever getting recommended is prescription medication, right? They may not know that there's actually multiple different supplements that could be, in some cases, equally, if not maybe even a better option for many patients with depression.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting to me because, a lot of these supplements have a lot less likelihood for side effects and can often be just as efficacious when you look at some of the data that, for example, SAMe,
Mm-hmm.
and then even saffron extract.
Yeah.
When you look at the data for those, similar effect to antidepressants, really.
Yeah, those are some of the best options available, and really, depending on what patients have tried and what their tolerability and what their what they can afford. Right, there's a lot of different variables that kind of go into this, but there's many others, things like 5-HTP and turmeric, rhodiola rosea, lithium orotate, even zinc and vitamin D. Right, all these things can be useful. Maybe on their own, but probably more so in combination with either other supplements or in combination with medication.
Absolutely. And especially if someone's willing to, improve their nutrition and maybe supplement some with some of these things, I think we can often see a really good outcome.
Yeah, and I'll say that definitively, I've had many patients that are currently taking antidepressant medication, and maybe they're maxed out on a dose of an antidepressant, right? Or maybe they respond really poorly to antidepressants, and we just don't have a whole lot of other options, other good options. A lot of times, adding an adjunct supplement to supplement, right, their antidepressant medication can be a really good strategy.
All right. So what about medications? We're not really going to do a deep dive, but any thoughts you want to highlight real quick on that?
Yeah, in terms of the antidepressant medications, if you've seen a psychiatrist, you're probably pretty familiar with these ones. Most of them are serotonin based, right? So they help. Basically serotonin lasts a little bit longer, in between the neurons, right? And so they can be helpful for not only depression, but some other mental health disorders as well. But they're not the only class that we use for depression. We call them antidepressants, but we also have, medications that are what we call like atypical antidepressants. And then we also have antipsychotic medications that sometimes we'll use for our more severe cases or more treatment resistant cases. And then going back to what Dr. Binus said about sleep earlier, is sometimes I can treat somebody's depression by treating their sleep. I don't even have to give them an antidepressant, but I can give them something specifically for sleep, and that can make a massive difference in their overall mood. And then there are some lesser known medications that are sometimes used as adjuncts. So this might include things like lithium, lamotrigine, or even ketamine.
Absolutely. Well, in our last section here, let's just touch on biological treatments that are not medication.
So the first thing is TMS. Most people, when I mention that acronym, don't know what that is, right? A lot of them will say, "Is that like electrical thing?" Right? And generally, they're thinking ECT. But Dr. Binus, you've got a lot of experience with TMS, so why don't you give us a kind of a brief overview of that?
Yeah, several years ago, I actually was looking more closely at it because I was thinking about getting a machine. We actually did end up getting a TMS machine, a transcranial magnetic stimulation is what it stands for. And so it's been really interesting to see some of my most difficult depressive cases respond. Now, I'm not saying not everyone responds, right? But most people actually have a significant response rate, even some of the most severe cases that I've seen. And I've been happily surprised. But basically, what is it? Well, there's an MRI strength magnet that is used to basically induce um, it's a magnetic pulse and electromagnetic pulse, and that stimulates the left frontal lobe. Because one of the things that we see over and over again in neuroimaging studies where they look at the brain on images is that when people are depressed, the left frontal lobe is underactive. And by the way, it's kind of interesting because oftentimes the right frontal lobe is actually overactive. And so with TMS, typically the protocol that is used is that we will actually find, you got to do what we call mapping. So you have to find the right place on the brain, and you do it externally, so on the head, and then you're sending electromagnetic pulses into that part of the brain, which is in the left frontal lobe, and that actually stimulates it. So it helps to kind of jumpstart that underactive part of the brain. So it works differently, right? Because the medications are working from a chemical standpoint. In other words, they're changing the brain chemistry, like with the serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. The transcranial magnetic stimulation, on the other hand, is working with the electricity of the brain. So it's more directly stimulating the nerve cells. And sometimes people, when the neurochemicals aren't enough to kind of jumpstart the brain, if you will, then the electrical impulses, the electromagnetic impulses can actually jumpstart that part of the brain.
So I hear people saying, Dr. Binus, is this like, how effective is this? What kind of rates do we see, in our clinic in terms of?
So it's a great question. And actually we to meet criteria for insurance, I wish I could use it for mild and moderate depressed patients, but unfortunately at this point, most insurances only cover the severely depressed patients. So this is for the severely depressed category. And we actually see some really good rates, especially for that population. We see approximately 70% response rate, and right around 40 to 45% of remission rate. And so what does that mean? Well, response means there's significant improvement. And so 70% of those severe patients will improve, at least in our clinic. And overall studies show similar results depending on what population is chosen and whatnot. But then the remission rates mean basically you don't meet criteria for depression anymore after treatment. And so that's about 45%, depending on when we collect that data in snippet of time. But it's a pretty exciting numbers in my mind.
No, absolutely. Especially with the side effect profile, when you kind of compare that to many of the medications as well.
Exactly. Because really it's side effect for TMS is very minimal. Other than people often do have a little discomfort during treatment, although after about 3 or 4 treatments, it's usually perfectly fine and most people are very comfortable. But other than that, it's very well tolerated. There's a very, very small risk of inducing a seizure that really is only for people that are already predisposed to having seizures. It's very unlikely. So beyond that, it's very well tolerated.
So that leads us into kind of our last, or I should say, the last treatment we included on this list. Not to say that there aren't other treatments out there, but ECT, right? This is the one that everybody's kind of scared of. The one that I'm always nervous to make a recommendation for, because
people always think about one flew over the cuckoo's nest. Right?
Exactly, but ECT still to this day, even though it's been around for decades, I think for many is still considered kind of the gold standard for treatment resistant cases of depression.
Yeah. And it really is still, although I will be honest and say I hesitate, like I think you do, to recommend it until that, in my mind, it's kind of like, okay, we really don't have any other good options. And then we need to kind of open up that discussion. But what are some of the reasons other than kind of the stigma that you hesitate sometimes on the ECT?
Well, one is it's there's not very many facilities that offer ECT. In our area, and many of my patients would have to drive over an hour for all of their treatments, and it's not like you just get one treatment. You have to go multiple times in many cases. So that's one problem. There's kind of the cost and inconvenience associated with that. Obviously that's relatively minimal considering if you're that severely depressed, you might just take about anything. But we are inducing seizures, right? So it is a surgical procedure, right, that has to be done. And, one of the most common and a very concerning side effect for a lot of people is the memory loss
Mhm.
associated with ECT. And so this can be a big deal. People can lose a decent amount of time, right, in when they do ACT. Above and beyond that, though, in any other comments kind of about certain side effects?
Yeah, I mean the main other thing I think I'd say is when I've talked with people, the whole experience of going through anesthesia and having to be put under, it can literally, for some people, especially if they're already depressed and feeling vulnerable, kind of traumatize them.
Mm,
The whole experience. I mean, there's people that look back and they're like, "Oh, that was just a horrible experience." And I'm not trying to talk down. I have completely on it, right? Because I have actually seen it have amazing results in a very small amount of patients that I've actually had that have gone through ECT.
yeah.
But there's other people that have gone through it that I've talked to afterwards, and they're just like, yeah, it didn't. So it's definitely not a cure all.
Sure. And the studies have essentially shown that, once again, we're talking about the most severe cases. And so really, if anything has a decent likelihood of working in this type of patient population, like it's still worthy of consideration. But, in a meta-analysis, which is a collection of many different studies, this was 17 studies specifically, they showed that there was a 41% remission. So that was complete, elimination of all depressive symptoms, or most of the depressive symptoms. And about a 60% response rate with ECT.
Yeah, and in my mind, it's like, I mean, that's okay, but I was
Not
actually
always worth the risk.
yeah, and so we have to weigh all of that. And again, I'm not completely against ECT, just mostly against ECT. and the reason being, like, I think even a lot of those severe cases, if we really use this holistic approach we've talked about, we can get a lot better. So
Yeah, that's a good point. So lastly, we'll just kind of touch up, what is the prognosis for patients with major depressive disorder, Dr. Binus?
Well, it's actually pretty good. Yeah, they've even done naturalistic studies that show that most people, given, several months or a year or so, even without treatment, will sooner or later get better. And that's kind of like, okay, well, if I've been working with somebody for, 12 months on their depression and they start to get better, I'm like, oh, did we finally, get the right combination of meds and therapy and interventions? Or is this just, part of naturally getting better? So overall, for most people, the prognosis is actually good.
And for those that do have multiple depressive episodes, we also know, something called the kindling effect, right? With each subsequent episode, you're more likely to have another episode, right? So when you've had multiple episodes, the prognosis, it's not quite as good, but if you work with somebody, and, we're going to continue to advocate for a holistic approach, right? But if you work with somebody that's very comprehensive, that has a very individualized treatment plan, that's willing to incorporate, kind of a lot of these things that we talked about today, then I can, speak from my own personal experience, and I'm sure you do too, but a lot of patients, that have gone, other clinics and just weren't getting the services they really needed, have come to our clinics and made major turnaround.
Absolutely. And to me, that's one of the most exciting things, not just as a clinician, but as a human being.
Absolutely.
To watch people come out of that fog, to watch them get that hope again and the joy and the meaning in life, and start to connect with other relationships and the things that they used to enjoy, and maybe new things that they can enjoy. So, I think we have a great job. And it really is exciting when we put these different things together. So I really hope that for all of you listeners, that this is a podcast that brings about a lot of hope and encouragement for you, especially if you or someone that you care about is dealing with depression, that there are things that can be done, and that when we put these things together, that you can get better and life can be really joyful and meaningful again.
Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.